How's it going, everybody? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is chess.com on the World Wide Web, and today we are going to be starting a new video series that I was inspired to do, having watched some excellent video lectures by FIDE Master Elliott Liu and my partner, International Master David Pruss, who are doing a great job in bringing us videos in this series, Amazing Games for Beginners. And when I was first given an assignment at the beginning of last year to do the Everything You Must Know video series about chess, which is a free video series here on chess.com, and hopefully many of you have seen it, to basically try to summarize and give some perspective that if you had one chess lesson in your life, or if someone could give you as much general knowledge about the game in an hour that they could, what would you talk about? And so we set out to do that series, and there was a lot of material and ideas I had about really covering really basic and important fundamentals that people should know that we really just didn't have time to get into in the Everything You Must Know video series. And it doesn't necessarily apply into the Amazing Games for Beginners series either. And so what I decided was to start a new video series. As you can see the title here, Patterns Everyone Must Know, and we're going to be, after the colon, it'll be different topics each time, but I'm really excited about the series because I feel like it will not only give you knowledge that you need to go out there and tackle all the chess players in the world and achieve your goals and be successful, hopefully, like I said, arm you with some knowledge, but also hopefully give you the right approach and to let you a little bit in on some of the secrets or some of the insight that great chess players understand as far as what makes them good chess players and how they approach positions and what exactly they're able to do in positions that you can't figure out. We all have those positions where you just, calculation by itself can't reach the end of the game. You can't quite gather enough information over the board to make a really confident decision, so you have to rely on your previous experience, and that's what makes great chess players is their previous experience and their knowledge of, ding ding ding, guess what the video series is called? Patterns. So chess is a game of pattern recognition, really, and if you think about just, from a general sense that chess has billions of possible positions, literally, you can look it up, there are billions of possible chess positions, and that's before we even tap open the chess 960 bottle and start pouring that out, right? And so eventually, even if classical chess is even if, let's say, 960 is played as much as classical chess, the patterns that you can execute in your games based on previous knowledge of a certain type of pawn structure, a certain type of mating net, a certain type of just a fundamental tactical idea that kind of layers on itself and becomes more and more advanced. When you start to see all these patterns in games and you start to be able to recognize them ahead of time, you're doing something that all great chess players do, and that is using your previous experience and applying patterns and knowledge that you know, and of course you have to calculate as accurately as you can and try to make the best move and not blunder, but really your decisions, your intuitive decisions about the general flow of the game are being based on your previous experience, just like in life, and so that's all you can pull from. And so giving you knowledge of, here's a bunch of patterns that you really need to know in order to be a good chess player, giving you that knowledge is what we're setting out to do here in this video series. I hope everybody is as pumped about this as I am, especially in the beginning of this series, and we'll see how long it lasts. I intended for this series to generally be for beginning chess players up to about maybe the intermediate level, somewhere maybe 14, 15, 1600 rated here on either the chess.com server or even over the board play. I think that these patterns, some of them may be good for even players at that level. I don't know that we'll really get into a lot of advanced patterns beyond that, because technically that's where you start to get into really specific themes, right? That's why we have a video series on king and pawn endings, right? That's why I have a video series on isolated queen pawns. So once you open the door to advanced tournament level chess, of course, you're looking at things on such a deep level that they all kind of deserve their own topic, and those will probably just continue to be covered by our awesome video author team, and you can learn as much chess as you can from those videos. So I'm not necessarily going to continue this series into the really advanced stages of chess, but for coaches out there, or for people who, even advanced players who just want to review some of these fundamentals or hear what Danny's take is on what you need to know, of course you can still stick around. But if you're an advanced player who's really looking to have your rocks socked and your socks rocked off and your world blown open with some new knowledge, then you're probably going to be disappointed by this, because generally this is, like I said, for beginning chess players up to about the intermediate level. So the question is, what do you need to know? about chess. What patterns do you need to know? What positions do you need to know so that you can start to execute the right ideas in your games, and so you can start building pattern recognition? As I said, chess has so many billions of possible positions that if you were approaching things like you've seen it for the first time all the time, well, you'd probably be dead in the water, right? And certainly great chess players don't do that. Obviously, these days, opening preparation and really strong calculation skills are probably two of the biggest things that really make a very strong grandmaster these days. But of course, experience and knowledge of strategical and tactical patterns is still also very, very critical to become a grandmaster and a great chess player. So that's what we're going to jump into here. What do you need to know? Well, we're going to start with the basics, because there are hundreds of positions, if maybe not even upwards of almost maybe 1,000 positions that masters need to know. But we're going to start with the really basic. Today is the basic tactics, and so we're going to jump right in here to discussing the first tactical pattern that you need to know in order to be a great chess player. And I put them in a list here that you can see right in front of you right now. That, in my opinion, is like the list of, let's say, the most common tactical patterns up to like the least common tactical patterns. And remember that we're going to get into a bunch of different things, and so sometimes people consider a certain idea like a perpetual check or something a tactical pattern. I didn't necessarily classify it as a tactical pattern here. You see on the right side there's an article linked up where we have a giant list of tactical patterns that you can review, and those, though, to be clear, are to offer advice for people who are trying to tag our tactics trainer puzzles, because those are all different themes. I would say there are more themes in that article. You'll see the definitions and example article right there to the right of this video you're watching. Those are just as much themes as they are actual tactics. Okay, so they're just as much patterns in terms of themes as they are tactics. Right now, what we're going to focus on is just the basic tactics. So again, here you can see this list. The most common, perhaps, all the way to the most advanced of the fundamental tactical patterns. Some of those you see there are really wouldn't be considered basic tactics, so you can see on this list, but they are fundamental that you need to know, and I came up with a list of roughly 15 of them, and I hope you're excited about this, so we're going to review them. And the way this works, like I believe anyone should do in their own chess games, is we're going to start with the most stripped down, right, the most absolute fundamental version of a tactic, like right at its core, and then you'll see that you can start to add on top of it to the point where you're executing very complex tactical ideas, but they're based on a very fundamental piece of knowledge that you now have, right? They're based on a very fundamental thing, like knowing what a pin is what you need to know in order to execute a much more advanced type of tactic or mating net. So you'll see that that's really the whole point of approaching chess from that pattern recognition standpoint. You really arm yourself with knowledge, then you back it up and you start getting experience with all different types of positions, and you see those patterns repeat to the point where you're looking at things that are very advanced, but you understand the most simplified version so well that you're able to figure it out and kind of keep those core fundamentals at the base of all your calculations, at the root of all your decision making. So without any other further ado, a lot of talking here. I hope everyone is ready, and we're going to jump right in. You could argue that the original tactic, the original combination, or the original anything that the first step of swindling your opponent always has to be the double attack. And that's because technically, if you're not attacking two things at once and you're just making one singular threat, generally it's much easier to stop. You attack a piece, your opponent recognizes it and decides whether or not it's an issue, and then defends the threat. So the double attack was the original bad guy, right? To attack two things at once, forcing your opponent to lose something, is the original tactic. And so we're going to clarify that a double attack and a fork are essentially the same thing. Trying to use original examples, right now just made up examples to get you familiar with the pattern, and then we'll back up and we'll start to try to look at more and more advanced and more practical, and perhaps in many cases very famous double attacks and forks. So a double attack by definition is the act of attacking two pieces at once. Pretty simple, right? You're attacking at least two things at once, maybe three, four things, okay? You don't even need to call it a triple or a quadruple attack as long as you recognize that it's a double attack. That's the basic pattern. A fork is a double attack by a knight or a pawn. So in this position, we first have a double attack set up by a pawn, and by definition this is a double attack for the pawn because neither the knight nor the rook move diagonally, right? You wouldn't necessarily call this a fork if it was a bishop on e7, and therefore that bishop could probably just capture the pawn on f6. So the double attack or fork is defined because the piece doing the double attacking or the forking moves in such a way that the pieces it's attacking cannot just capture it, right? So this is pretty basic stuff, but the pawn is forking the knight and rook currently. There's also this move bishop to d3, which highlights a fork by the bishop. attacking the rook on b5 and attacking the undefended knight on f1. Double attacks and forks work best when you're attacking two undefended pieces, or with a pawn, in the case of a pawn, if a pawn ever has a chance for a double attack or a fork, it's almost always successful because the pawn is worth less than all the rest of the pieces. So even if a piece were to move, for example, and get the pawn back, you're almost always happy to have traded a pawn for a piece. So once again, this is not a practical example, just to show you two quick positions of a double attack. And of course, any definition, any example of a fork or double attack wouldn't be complete without the knight getting involved. Here we see the knight can move to c7, thus forking the king on e8 and the queen on a8. This is a very basic example of a fork, and again, no one would begrudge you if you referred to a double attack by a rook or a bishop as a fork, or if you simply referred to this move as a double attack. It's just that typically the chess terminology that's used is a fork when you're talking about a knight and a pawn doing double attacks, and just a straight double attack when you're talking about one of the long-range pieces or the king attacking more than one piece at a time. So usually refer to those as double attacks. But again, I'm not going to constantly correct myself and be clear about the terminology, so don't sit there and wait in the comments to be like, Danny, you called a fork a double attack and and then you get to be intellectually superior than me. So believe me, it doesn't take a lot of hard work to sound smarter than me. So if you're waiting in the comments to call me out on any mistakes, or even the names of mating nets for the future, by the way, I appreciate the clarification, but I don't guarantee that I will get all these names right. There have been hundreds of great chess players through history, and we're going to try to name everything properly, but my point is to arm you with the knowledge, not to necessarily make myself sound like a chess historian. Anyway, here's another double attack, and it is one that, in my opinion, sometimes is overlooked by a lot of coaches when they're quickly trying to teach their children about what a double attack and a fork is. Obviously, the concept of attacking two pieces at once is easy to understand, and all the examples I've showed you up to this point were just that. But in this case, we see a double attack involving a threat. White plays the move queen to e4, which immediately unleashes an attack and a threat of checkmate on h7. Well, obviously that must be dealt with, and when it is, White will immediately capture the undefended rook on a8. Even a move such as moving the rook doesn't necessarily avoid the checkmate. So Black would have to deal with this threat of checkmate by moving one of these pawns, perhaps this one, and as soon as the rook is captured, there's no way for Black to trap this queen over here, which would be beyond the scope of the puzzle here anyway. And we see that the purpose of the double attack was that there was a double attack of an undefended piece and a threat, not just a double attack of undefended pieces. So to clarify that, that's another example of a double attack. And here we see yet another similar example of a double attack that is based on an undefended piece and a threat or square. So again, does not necessarily have to be two undefended pieces or even the direct threat of checkmate in one. In this position, White plays the move queen over to d3, attacking the undefended rook on f1, as well as threatening to play checkmate by queen to d8. In this situation, the black queen has no checks or no ways to save or protect the back rank in time. And when Black either must move the rook to a safe square and allow the checkmate, or surrender to the fact that he just went from a winning endgame, queen and rook are better than a queen and knight, to a losing endgame because he must free the back rank and give up the material and head into a lost endgame. So again, here we see a double attack based on a threat or an undefended square. What we eventually will start to see is that a double attack is a repeating thing in so many other combinations. We're going to get to discoveries and discovery double checks, which by definition are double attacks, and even many forms of decoy and deflection and clearance sacrifices and overloading ideas and removal of the defenders are in many ways you could define them. Well, by definition, you're threatening two things at once, so that's also a double attack. So you will see that the double attack and the fork in their most purified nature are very simple. You're attacking two things at once, whether it's two undefended pieces or the threat of something and perhaps even just the threat of something and the threat of another thing, or the threat of something and an undefended piece. So the concept of a fork or a double attack should be clear. I could go on with hundreds and thousands, and of course you can find many throughout the internet. So we're going to move on to the next most common one, which is the pin. To define a pin, we start with a very, very commonly reached position, especially on the levels of amateur play when players first learn the concepts of developing all their pieces and they're focused on attacking the center without much much deeper planning going on past that. We see that here white has 2 pins in the position, one being an absolute pin and one being a relative pin. Now, this is important because generally the pin happens so often in chess games that some are more let's say, lethal than others, right? In this case, neither one of these pins is really that deadly. We're just using them to highlight a point that when bishops develop, oftentimes they will naturally pin knights. With black, of course, also had the option last move to develop to pin a knight. So pins happen very often in the opening stage when bishops develop to attack knights. The difference between an absolute pin and a relative pin is that an absolute pin means a piece is pinned to the king. That's it, because the piece is absolutely not allowed to move. It would be illegal, according to the rules of chess, to move a piece and put your own king in check. You can try to do so, and most of the computer programs and servers are smart enough, they'll simply snap that piece right back, as you can see, because it's illegal. So an absolute pin is when a piece is absolutely pinned to your king, and that piece, it would be illegal to move, so those tactics would obviously be the most forcing, as anytime your opponent is illegally prevented from moving a piece, then of course the pressure you could build up would probably be that much stronger, because the piece is never ever going to be allowed to move as long as that absolute pin remains intact. Now, a relative pin is almost as lethal, because generally you would almost never be in a situation to move a knight and give up a queen for any piece behind it, even if that knight were pinned, let's say, by a rook along a file to the queen. You would rarely be in a position where moving the knight would get you something more valuable than losing a queen for a smaller piece. So a relative pin is also a very, very strong tactic. But what we'll point out is that the absolute pin is the most forcing. We're going to do a few more examples of that. And when we get to a couple examples of the relative pin, what you're going to see is that though many in most cases will definitely fall under the category of you would never want to move a piece that was pinned to your queen, or even a knight pinned to the rook by a bishop, or usually relative pins are almost as good. Relative pins, when used well, can quickly turn into discover tactics, which would be a case where if there was a moment to move the piece that's pinned to attack something more valuable, often then the piece that is behind it, the piece that was pinned, can be now considered to be attacking the former pinner, the piece that was pinning. I know that's a lot of P words, a lot of pinnings I'm using here. I'm just trying to get the concept across that when a pinned piece moves for something more valuable, in the rare case that it does, often you will see other tactics associated very quickly with it, and of course there better be something good if you're ever going to be risking the loss of a large amount of material. So with that said, let's do a couple more examples here of pins that you should know. Quickly, still being introduced to the pin, we see 2 more basic examples, with the rook pinning the knight absolutely to the king, and the bishop also having the possibility of moving to a2, also pinning the rook absolutely, an absolute pin to the king. And with our final, before we show a few examples of the basics of exploiting a pin and how we use this tactic to our advantage, we see a couple more relative pins, with the rook on e6 applying a relative pin from the bishop to the queen. And in this case, we see it as not a very lethal or powerful pin, because one, a rook would not really be interested in giving itself up for a bishop if the queen could just easily capture back. And without other threats against this pinned bishop, this would be kind of a dud, right? A dud pin. Whereas in this case, we also have a bishop. We also have another pin to the queen, but in this case, because the bishop is less valuable than the rook, the bishop being worth 3 and the rook being worth 5, obviously this is a powerful pin because the rook doesn't want to move in the case of losing the queen. And even if it doesn't, the bishop would have no problem giving itself up for this rook, as the bishop is typically worth less. In most positions, the point value is definitely one where the bishop is worth less, according to those rules of the point values in chess. But in most positions, that would almost always be the case too, that the rook would be a potentially better piece than the bishop. So finally, these are just a couple more examples of really basic ways to just visualize a pin and get familiar with what exactly a pin is. We're just defining it. So before we move on to the next one, we'll give you a few examples, the basic examples of how you would exploit a pin. Here in this sort of abstract position reached out of an opening, we see that white has a pin of the knight on f6 to the queen on d8 by the bishop on g5, a relative pin. And the basic strategy of using a pin to your advantage is not like a fork or a double attack. They're a little more direct, right? You attack the piece and you're going to do something next move, either whether that's executing a threat or taking an undefended piece. It's very forcing. The pin itself is best The pin itself is best when you bring more attackers to the pinned piece. So it's not that the pinner is going to be executing the tactic most of the time. Simply making a capture of this piece wouldn't really do much if the queen could just take right back, or the knight or the pawn. In any case, in most situations, if the pinning piece just simply makes a trade, then they didn't really achieve anything with the pin. The basic point of a pin is to always bring more attackers. So whenever you recognize a pin, the goal is to simply bring more attackers. And though this is a bad move, the point is this position was set up just to simply highlight that the best move here for white is a move like e5, attacking the knight on f6, which of course is unable to move because you would rather lose a knight than a queen for a bishop. So again, just in action, an instant replay, you see that the most basic way to use a pin is to exploit it by attacking the pin piece further. In some cases, 2 attackers may not be enough. You may have to bring more and more attackers to the pin piece and take advantage of the fact that it's pinned. But in this case, a pawn is enough because a pawn is worth less than a knight, so making a trade on f6 and giving up the pawn for the knight would not be a big deal. So first way you take advantage of a pin, bring more attackers to it. The second, and I guess you would say slightly less common way we take advantage of a pin tactic in chess, is to always try to recognize what the pinned piece's responsibilities are. It's kind of like the overloading tactic we'll eventually get to, which is that when a piece is pinned, obviously, especially in the case of an absolute pin, whatever pieces it's currently attacking or defending are not really, that's not really the case. They're sort of phantom attacks or defense, because if a piece is pinned, then it really doesn't have any other responsibilities besides keeping his king out of check, right? Especially, again, in the case of an absolute pin. And even in a relative pin, the other way we take advantage of it, so like I said, the first one we talked about this, you bring more attackers to attack the pin piece. Here we're going to see you take advantage of it in conjunction with kind of an overload. I guess I would qualify it as an overloading tactic as well, which is to recognize what are the pinned piece's responsibilities and can I exploit that in any way. Well, in this case, the bishop on the bishop on b2 is pinning the pawn on g7, which makes this move a surprising tactic at first for beginners and amateurs to see a move like that. Pawn can't take the queen because, of course, he'll be in check. And in this case, the king would have to move, and queen takes g7 is checkmate. So we see there we took advantage of the pinned piece, as this is normally considered a defense, pawn protecting a pawn, but in this case, because the pawn is pinned, that is, like I said, more of a phantom defense, because legally, like I said, you try to make this move, servers and computers won't even allow you to do it. And of course, in a real game, you wouldn't be allowed to make an illegal move either. So this pinned piece was not really doing anything else in the position besides being pinned to the king. So recognize that in your games, that the other way to take advantage of a pinned piece is to attack its responsibilities. If it seems to be defending something, then take advantage of that, because it's not really defending them if its responsibility is to protect the piece behind it because it's pinned. And here we see checkmate. So in summary, I would say that those are the two ways, indeed, we take advantage of a pinned piece. Bringing more attackers to it and overwhelming it until we are winning some amount of material, hopefully, or achieving another goal. Or by taking advantage of the pinned piece's limited abilities because it's pinned. And so we look for ways to overwhelm this piece and to take advantage of the fact that it can't really move as long as it's pinned. As we move on to our third pattern, I want to remind everybody that, remember, this is exactly what it says. You're meeting the basics here. You're just introducing yourself to the basic tactical patterns. The next video, which I'll be doing and will be published pretty shortly, beyond the basics, will be one where we see a lot more examples and sort of see all these tactical patterns come together. Right now, we're kind of trying to introduce you to these 15 concepts I laid out as patterns you need to be aware of, and then as we get to more advanced things here, you'll see that, like I said, many of the tactical patterns sort of intertwined. Right now, when you first start to learn something, it's very like, here's an idea, and this is what it is. It's an element that exists like this, and you don't really have any intuition about it or any creativity behind it. But once those things are sort of cemented in your brain, then you start to see, them on a much deeper level and see how all the tactics kind of are intertwined and all that stuff. So I just want to remind you that this is really basic right now. We're literally just introducing you to the different types of tactics so that you know how to recognize them. And in the next video, beyond the basics, we will already be seeing all of these again on much more advanced levels and a lot more trickery and really important patterns that you should know, because there are so many great tactic books and things out there where you can learn these tactical patterns and things, and this is, like I said, just same sort of thing here, just in a video format, and trying to give you the right approach in terms of starting with the most simplified version. I believe is the best way to do it, and then to get more advanced. So I just feel like we're running through so many basic examples here. I don't want people to get impatient. Here we see the opposite of a pin, which is a skewer. And introducing the two, I want to remind you that something I didn't point out in the pin example is that the only pieces capable of pins are the long-range pieces, that being the queens, rooks, and bishops. By definition, you're attacking a piece and it can't move because of something behind it. That implies a diagonal or a file, one of the straight vertical lines, one of the straight lines in chess, whether that's a diagonal, a file, or a rank. So just drawing arrows here to show you that. Quickly, what I would point out is that in this position, this is a really good example of skewers because we see several different ways to skewer. A skewer is the opposite of a pin. Rather than attacking a piece and it can't move because a better piece is behind it, the piece can't move for fear of losing a bigger piece, a skewer is actually a much more forcing combination in general because you're attacking a piece up front and it has to move, and whatever's behind it, you win it. Doesn't matter to you if it's less valuable than the piece you just attacked or more valuable. A skewer is the opposite of a pin because you're attacking a valuable piece, it has to move, and you win the valuable piece behind it. Here's one example of a skewer. The rook can move to d8. Skewering the king to the undefended rook on d1. The rook can move to h5, skewering the king to the undefended knight on a5. The king in both those cases, by the way, has to move to a safe square, and you'll win whatever's behind it. And even this move is a skewer. I set up this one specifically to show you that a skewer is not always winning big pieces. Here you're simply attacking a valuable piece. It moves no matter where it goes. You don't care. You're going to win the pawn that's behind it. So depending on the particular position, of course, and as many of the ones I've given you are not really practical anyway, just designed to highlight the pattern itself. A skewer is exactly that. You attack a piece. It has to move because it's going to get taken, and you're going to win whatever's behind it. In some cases, you may see that the attacked piece, for fear of losing something behind it, simply gives itself up, like this example here. The white rook moves to g1, attacking the queen, and skewering it to the g7 pawn for fear of the fact that the black queen can't simply move for fear of checkmate. So in some ways you could actually call that a pin. You see how tightly they are related, the pin and the skewer, right? Because technically the threat of checkmate should be considered more valuable than the queen, despite the fact that she's the first lady of chess, and we always know that no one wants to lose the queen, right? But it'd be hard to call it a pin in the sense that a pawn itself is not more valuable than the queen, right? But usually a pin is you're attacking the less valuable piece and it doesn't want to move because there's a more valuable piece behind it. So in this case, that's certainly not the case. The pawn is a less valuable piece. However, the threat of checkmate is more valuable than the queen. So in this case, I would refer to it as a skewer and a pin. I guess we're skewering the queen to the threat of checkmate, and in that case, because checkmate is more valuable than the queen is also pinned. So we see that this is an example of a skewer where, as I said in the last one, you're attacking a valuable piece, it has to move, and you win what's behind it. I wanted to highlight that in some cases, what's behind it is maybe as valuable, or your opponent just makes a practical decision, says, hey, I obviously can't give up what's behind it, so I have to give up the piece that's now being attacked. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a pin. I would still refer to this as a skewer, skewering the queen to the pawn, but under technical terms, I'm not sure exactly what we would call it. But the most important point here, of course, is that you understand the pattern, not that I'm getting the names right. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of a skewer, seen as one of the climax positions in the Searching for Bobby Fischer movie with Josh Waitzkin. A lot of people saw that movie and inspired a generation of chess players. But the end of that long, drawn-out, over-exaggerated, and dramatized for television combination, which of course is true and we all love it, that's TV for you folks. But the end of that combination involves a very famous skewer that is actually rather common and something that all players should always be aware of when they're calculating long lines and endgames and trying to figure out who queens first. Sometimes you have to remember to calculate beyond just who gets a queen, who promotes, but the resulting positions of the kings. In this position, white does not have time to bring the king around and stop the black pawn. If king d4, h4, king d3, h3, king e2, h2, we clearly see that that's a loss. And so both sides are simply pushing, and white sees no reason not to push at this point, as it seems that he's queening first. But What he doesn't realize is that, or maybe he does realize it doesn't matter because back in that beginning position he was lost anyway, that when both sides queen, we end with a skewer on the white king. Most pieces would not be as valuable as the queen, but the one piece that has to move when he's attacked is the king, right? When you attack the king, he's in check, so he has to move. So most cases you would give up any piece rather than lose your queen behind it, but in the case of a king being attacked, you don't have a choice but to move your king, and you lose what's behind it. So again, this is a very, very famous skewer we can see in action that ends this long line of advancing the pawns and both sides promoting, and a very good one to be familiar with, a very famous skewer. To summarize the skewer here, I'm going to use an example that is actually used in that article linked to the right of the video. I've been trying to avoid doing that to give you the most exposure possible, but because this position highlights a skewer for us repeatedly over and over and in such a beautiful fashion, I think it's a great way to highlight exactly what a skewer is. Here white plays the move rook to a8, seemingly a sacrifice, trying to deflect or let's say decoy the queen to the square. We'll get to decoys and deflections. If the rook is captured, we skewer the king and queen, and we win the game. So the queen has to move. Moving to e6 would also walk into a skewer. Moving to d5 would actually walk into a pin. So we see the skewer and the pin are brothers, and they remain linked in many ways, as we've already shown. Moving to c4 would allow another skewer. Moving to b3 would clearly lose the queen, and so moving to a2 seems to be the only other remaining safe square. But after rook takes a4, another exclama viach, queen has to go back to the square it started on. We go back to the square we started on, and that's something pretty. And now the a2 square is no longer available, so the last remaining square is h7, and we climax this position, bring it to a close with the move bishop to g6, deflecting the queen to g6 in a forcing way, and we end with the skewer of the king on the queen. So if that position doesn't highlight for you exactly the power of the skewer and a pin and how they work well together, then you're a lost cause. No, seriously, you're not a lost cause. Nobody's a lost cause. But let's just say you're a chess player that only your mother can love. Also highly offensive. Way to go, Danny. Great. Okay, so now we're going to move on with the summary of the skewer and the three most fundamental tactics: the double attack and fork, which I consider one, the pin, and the skewer, which you took a lot more time on just to really get those ingrained in you because they repeat more often than anything in chess. And so, to give you that quick summary, here you see the big three, as we're calling them, the first three tactical patterns of our list of 15 that we've covered here in part 1. It was not my original intention to break this introduction into the basic tactical patterns that you must know into 2 parts. But when recording a video that was longer than an hour, so for all of those of you who are going to be yelling at me and chess.com for jipping you and cutting down a video when you want it all in one and all that stuff, we were going to be sitting here for a video that was over an hour and easily over an hour. And so rather than continuing now for the remaining 12 tactical patterns, we're going to break this into the first part and let you enjoy what you've watched up to here. I know there was a lot of talking at the beginning of the video, but really trying to get just the points across that there are patterns in chess that you must know, and when you combine your experience and knowledge of patterns with good calculation skills and, like I said, opening preparation these days, then you can be a very strong player. So the first 3 tactical patterns that every beginning chess player must know are the double attack fork, the pin, and the skewer. And having seen those in display here today, you will be ready for part 2, which we plan on releasing immediately following this video. So stay tuned and get excited because we are going to be releasing parts 1 and 2 back to back as they were originally recorded as one. So enjoy that and leave any comments here in the forum, and we're going to see you around here on chess.com.